In our last lectures, we've been talking about people who place a lot of emphasis on cognitive variables, and not only, what goes on in your head, but then what goes on in the environment. That is, how you personally interact with the environment. And you will recall that we were saying it's very important how you perceive that environment. That is, the internal life of a person plays a big role in just determining what environment you're going to react to. And what changes here for many people is that some want to see the environment as kind of an objective world. Some theorists even refer to the environment like as the objective world. But when you looked at people like Julian Roeder and Walter Mischel, what you find with them is that they actually see the world out there is a world that you determine. Looks like, sure. Okay. Well, what I was just saying, in case we didn't get a chance to pick that up on the tape, is simply we have been talking about people who have a very complex cognitive approach to personality study. So much so that even the so-called objective environment becomes something that is determined by the way in which you perceive it. So for many people, the way in which the environment is determined by the way in which you perceive it, rather than necessarily the way the environment really is. And of course, when you study abnormal psychology, you will realize the bigger the discrepancy between what most people think that environment is and what you think that environment is will lead into psychopathology. That is, there is some general agreement amongst us about what's really out there in the environment. If you have a very extreme view of what's in the environment, then probably you can't function well in it. That's not what Bandura and Roeder and Mischel were talking about. What they were talking about is that even within the normal environment that we perceive, there simply are a lot of nuances in terms of how you might evaluate what you see. Now, having talked about that kind of cognitive complexity, we're now going to move on to a man who is going to take a very different approach to all this. And in fact, we're going to return in some ways to the trait theorists, and we're going to talk about Raymond Cattell. Now, Raymond Cattell actually was born in England, and you will see as we move through his theory, and I would alert you in the beginning, this is a complex theory, and some of the concepts that I will raise won't be very clear in the beginning until I get further into it and begin to make some distinctions that help you to understand some of the things that were said at the beginning. Now, as I said, Cattell was born in England, but he actually spent most of his career in the United States. He got all of his education in England, but then he came to Columbia University Teachers College in New York City. Then he went to Clark University. He was on the faculty at Harvard and at Duke. He went to the University of Illinois, where he was for, I think, like 27 or 28 years. And eventually, when he retired, he went on to the faculty of the University of Hawaii. Probably the fantasy of a lot of people in academia to go on to the faculty at the University of Hawaii. Now, what's really different with Cattell is he took on the position that personality theory should be well, not personality theory, but the study of personality should be atheoretical. So he believed that scientists should gather large amounts of data, just gather all the facts you can about people, and then develop a theory from what the data suggested, rather than have a theory and do experiments to determine, is your theory accurate or not. Now, most of the people we've been talking about up to now really, started with some kind of theory. And then they did their research to see, well, does my theory hold up if we do this kind of experiment or that kind of experiment? Instead, you're going to see here in a very intricate, complex, and unusual way, Cattell starts out with no assumptions about what personality is like. And he actually believed that psychology in general should always just gather large amounts of data before one would ever progress to any serious analysis. And he became, and he's known for this, like he is known for challenging us to have a lot of data before we draw any conclusions. One of the things that happened in his career, though, that it really did hurt him, is that late in his career, it was shown that, or announced, like that he was a member of the Eugenics Society. And the Eugenics Society, in its most extreme message, taught that human species could be improved by controlling breeding. And so many people began to be concerned that Cattell was a racist. And that caused people then not to pay as much attention to his science. Now, you will see that Cattell's approach to understanding personality is called the inductive, hypothetico-deductive spiral. And in this method, one gathers considerable data, and then you examine the data for whatever insights are in them. And by the way, I will be clearer about this as we go along, because right now this may seem rather difficult to follow. When a person has gathered a lot of data and then, excuse me, looked into the data, one tries to make a kind of generalized statement about data. That is, one tries to, to take many variables and reduce them to less variables. So what we find with Cattell, he says, you gather a lot of data, then the scientist begins a process that he calls deduction, where you reason from a general statement to a particular observation. The observations then are tested, and the data from them lead to another cycle of our examining this data. Now, already you recognize this approach is very different from previous theorists who simply stated their conclusions, often with only observational data, and that observational data may only have been on clinic patients. And then they went on to make hypotheses and to test whether or not what they observed was really accurate. Now, Cattell starts off defining personality as that which tells what a person will do when placed in a particular situation. So you notice a prediction is important to Cattell, and he does want to be able to predict what will happen. And he expresses this in what at first appears to be a simple formula. R is a function of SP, where R stands for the nature and magnitude of a person's behavioral response. That is what a person says, thinks, or does. That's the response side. That's the R side. And we say that that is some function of S, S being the stimulus situation in which the person is placed, and P, the nature of his or her personality. So as you can tell, while the formula, when you first look at it, looks rather simple, you begin to recognize that there's a lot to go from P to R. Now, Cattell used many words that you didn't get that. Okay. You can see in this formula here that R represents the nature and magnitude of a person's behavioral response. That is what he or she says, thinks, or does. That's the response part of this formula. And what Cattell is saying is that that response is some function of the stimulus situation in which the person is placed, so whatever is occurring, and the nature of one's own personality. So in Cattell, he is saying there is an interaction between the personality of the individual and the environment in which the person is. And the goal here is to be able to predict a person's response in this environment. Now, Cattell, as I was mentioning, Cattell uses lots of words, and you'll find as we're going through this, you have to kind of translate the words because they're not what we use every day. He has this kinetic model, and the kinetic model is a framework that integrated environmental situations with genetic components of personality. This is a model that no one else really talks about. But it was common, for Cattell to use percentages to describe how much of a variable was environmental and how much was genetic. And in Cattell, he most often placed a significant percentage on the genetic. I mean, Cattell thought that what you are born with determines you to a great extent, but he certainly allowed that the environment does shape many things that one does. Now, Cattell actually is best known for a technique. It's really a statistical technique called factor analysis. And we will certainly not get sophisticated with factor analysis, but I will try to explain the technique to you sufficiently that you will be able to appreciate how Cattell used this in order to develop his theory. The key concept in factor analysis is that a number of variables intercorrelate to a high degree. And by intercorrelation, we mean that if one variable appears, it is likely several other variables will usually appear, and it's that combination of variables that give meaning to what we will call a factor. And in a moment, I'll explain how we get factors. So if we were to take an example, one might describe a person, let's say, as aggressive, forthright, impulsive, a take-charge person, as being opinionated. Let's put all those up. All right, so here's our person. And these are all descriptors now. The person's aggressive, forthright, impulsive, it's a take-charge person, opinionated. Now, when we say these are intercorrelated, what we mean is if you were to measure these variables for a person, normally when one appears, another will appear. So, for instance, an opinionated person is probably going to be an aggressive person. So if you have the characteristic of being opinionated in someone, probably the characteristic of aggression is there. And an aggressive person probably correlates a lot with being forthright. Now, the issue then, we examine all these variables that seem to intercorrelate, we need a name. Anybody want to venture how would you describe this person? Like, supposing we want to take one name and we want to say, this person who has these characteristics is a certain kind of person. What kind of person would you say that is? Pardon?
A CEO.
Okay, a CEO. So you would describe, right, you would describe a role. Okay. What we want to see is if we can find a label. Okay? Bossy. Okay? So you want to say that this person is bossy. That makes good sense. Okay? Aggressive, forthright, impulsive, take charge, opinionated. So we say the person is bossy. Anything else that you might think about? Controlling. Okay? So we might say this constellation of terms represents a controlling person. Okay, so we've got bossy, we've got controlling. Do we have anything else that you think this constellation?
Primary factors?
Pardon? Yes. Okay.
Demanding.
Demanding. Okay. This is a demanding person. All right. Now, here is the nature then of what happens. We could go on. We might come up with some others. Then, and this is what happens in factor analysis, we need to name this constellation. We have to decide, do we want to call this bossy? Do we want to call this demanding? What was our third? Controlling, yes. Do we want to call this person controlling? Whatever we choose, and by the way, we would all talk and we could argue and make our point, etc. But eventually we'll come up with some term. That becomes the factor. And the idea is that when you use this term, the implications of the term are, like when we say, we could use assertive. Supposing we said this person's assertive. Controlling would be very close. But supposing so let's say the person's controlling. What it means is every time we say controlling, we mean probably the factors that we mention over here are likely to be present. That is, these descriptors are likely to be present. So the goal of a factor is to be able to reduce the number of descriptors that are needed in order for us to understand some phenomena. And you'll see as we go along, of course, that this gets more and more complicated. And in some senses, it also gets more simple. Now, if person then, let's say we call this person controlling. And what we have done then is we have given our factor a name. And studies like this are done all the time, looking for factors that actually are broadly representative of how people are. Now, with Cattell, you'll see that he moves, depending on when you read his theory. At one point, he was saying there really are two kinds of factors. Some are primary factors, and they're relatively pure and kind of narrow, so he wasn't very interested in them because you can't do a lot with them. But he said if you take some of these factors and you combine a number of factors to what might be called secondary factors or second-order factors, then you have important information. Now, we could take another one. For example, supposing you have these words. Supposing you had sadness, anger, energyless, pessimism. Now, can you think of a factor we might use to describe that? Ah, it's wonderful. Yes. So we could say, perhaps, rather than say all these things, we could just say someone's depressed. So the factor, then becomes helpful to us because it takes in a number of things we don't have to bother to talk about because we kind of know if those factors are there, then the person is probably depressed. In fact, if you have all of those, you'll have a depressed person. Yes?
So the label is in secondary factors?
Yes. Yeah, these would be secondary factors. That's right, where we're grouping traits. Now, for Cattell, by the way, a trait really is a permanent entity. And it's either inborn or it develops during one's life. And importantly for Cattell is saying a trait regularly directs behavior. And Cattell developed a system, actually he borrowed it from Murray, and he used the term subsidiation, which is a term you are familiar with from Murray. And essentially this means that traits are arranged in a hierarchy from the most general and fewest, the more general it is, the fewer you're going to have, to the most specific and greatest in number. Now, Cattell's interest, by the way, was really in common traits. You want to go back to, okay. And okay, were you able to get that? All right. Remember that in subsidiation, you're going to have it's so that you're going to have fewer, traits at the top, and as you move down, of course, you're going to get more and more, and that's exactly what his interest was. Now, common traits indicate a trait which can be measured for all people by the same battery of tests, and on which people differ in degree rather than in form. One of the best known common traits was and is extroversion, introversion. You may remember that we talked about this with Julian Roeder under his introversion, extroversion scale. And Cattell believed that the behavior of everyone could be placed somewhere along this dimension. Now, common traits then, are behaviors where it would be very difficult to say somebody did not have something of this behavior. That is, if you look at people and you take a dimension like extroversion, introversion, you got these two extremes. The hypothesis is all of us are going to fall somewhere along that continuum. That is, no one is going to be totally extroverted, even though you probably can think of some people where you say to yourself, I know some people who I think are totally extroverted. But what you really mean is they're very far over on the scale toward the extroversion side. And there may be some people that you would say, this person is extremely introverted. I mean, you could hardly reach them. Well, what we're saying about that person is they have most of the characteristics of being introverted. They lack all the characteristics of being extroverted. But on this scale, no one really reaches either extreme. And everybody can be measured on it. And that's the key. Everyone can be measured on this scale. And so the question becomes, in some respects, where ideally might you want to be on the scale? And of course, this is a matter of preference. Most people don't want to be at the extremes. But some people would prefer to be more extroverted, and they may well be more extroverted. And if they are not, at least that is a goal that they have. Other people would prefer to be more introverted. And they either may be more introverted or they may be trying to move in that direction. In the latter case, most people who actually want to be more introverted tend to be that way. Now next, we have second-order traits. And these were important to Cattell because he believed that they really had a lot of generalizability. And therefore, he felt they were very helpful. Now, he extensively focused on two second-order traits. One, this is the wonderful thing about Cattell again and some of these theorists, he calls ex via, in via. And for him, that's extroversion, introversion. But he liked calling it ex via, in via. The other second-order trait that he had an interest in was anxiety. And he had a good understanding of anxiety in many ways. He refers to it as feelings of tension or distress. But the source of the tension or the distress is hard to define. Now, that's really excellent when you think about it because that captures the nature of anxiety. I mean, anxiety is a feeling that often is very difficult to define. You know it. I mean, intuitively, you know you're anxious. But often the very nature of anxiety is such that we're not quite positive what all its sources are. Then a third secondary trait that was important to Cattell was intelligence. And we are going to talk about intelligence in just a few moments because it's very key to him. Now next, Cattell talked about source traits. And these suggest that what we are dealing with a factor is with variations in value along it determined by a single unitary influence. So here, source traits have a single unitary influence. Alan, in your book, uses the example of emotionality being a trait. And he says it refers to such behaviors as calmness, jitteriness, cool-headedness, excitability. Again, you can see on a variable like emotionality that everybody has some emotionality. So you can move on that scale from the extreme of extreme emotionality to all the way to no emotionality. Of course, nobody has no emotionality, and nobody is always at the extreme of emotionality. So one fits easily on this scale. Now then, what happened with Cattell is he said, source traits can be further divided into three categories. First, there are ability traits. And these refer to the resources that one might have to deal with any given problem or any given challenge that you meet. For example, intelligence is often referred to as an ability trait. So intelligence is a resource you have to be able to cope. Then the second category is the temperament trait. That refers mostly to the style with which a person approaches a problem. And your author of your textbook, Dr. Allen, uses emotional versus stable as an example. And again, if you think about that, yes. In this case, of course, you're making emotionality something that may not necessarily be good. It depends on how you want to define it. So going from emotional to stable, you are now moving along a dimension in which probably there is part of that dimension that is more desirable than other parts. Now finally, Cattell focused extensively on what he called the dynamic trait. And dynamic traits actually referred both to motivations and to interests. And the dynamic trait is somewhat complex. And so Cattell then divided it into three parts. Its most basic part is called the erg, which is an innate source of reactivity that some people might describe as a drive. And it's directed to a certain goal. So he borrows this term erg, and as you know, it actually comes from physics. Erg is an energy. And in psychological terms, probably using drive is a good way to do this. So the drive is pushing you towards some end. So that's one part of a dynamic trait. Then he says under erg is the dynamic trait attitude, which focuses on the goal of the erg. So the attitude then refers to if you have this energy that's directing you towards something, what is it you're being directed towards? You're being directed toward a sentiment. And sentiment might be regarded as kind of one's feelings or attitudes toward broad categories. And they could be broad categories, you know, like a school. It could even be more broad. You'd be talking about your country. But these are very large categories, and most people can identify with them. Now, Cattell then developed what he called the dynamic lattice. And this reflected the relationships among attitudes, sentiments, and ergs. Now, if you look at our dynamic lattice that we have up here, and it's always interesting to me that this thing reads, you know, really from right to left, you know, if you want to understand it. The erg, that is the feeling, the drive that one has, in this case is going to be sex. And it's going to be directed toward a couple of attitudes that one might have. In this case, let's assume that this is a married couple. And so the wife's drive is towards her husband if he appears sexy. And if his physical condition is such that like he looks desirable now. So those would be the attitude level. And then the sentiment level, the broader concept is all this is directed toward the husband. He also used the example like of protection. If the drive is you want to be protected. And you might look to the armed forces as your source of protection. You might look to an even broader concept like the President of the United States. And these would all fall under the sentiment of your country. That would be the sentiment for here. And the third example works the same way, and that is that if the erg were to give into self-submission, and one were going to do that because of one's religious values, one might join a church, here in the case of the Catholic Church, or you might join some subcomponent of the Catholic Church, like let's say the Knights of Columbus, which is an organization within the church. But all of that is really focused on the sentiment of God. And Cattell liked this lattice. There are very intricate diagrams that he comes up with about this lattice that has all kinds of variables influencing other variables. It's interesting that in theories of personality textbooks, everybody feels a need to speak about this. Nobody uses this. I mean, this is not something that has really gone anywhere, this dynamic lattice, but it is something that, that people are so struck by because nobody else comes up with a scheme like this. So you want to know that it's one scheme that's been developed. It has not gone anywhere in the field. Now, sure.
So you said the diagram is like the order of the desire is like wrapped by like hierarchy?
No, these are independent. This dynamic lattice that we're showing you here is independent. There are some, though, it's a good question you're asking about, is there a hierarchy? There are some dynamic lattices where the top one might interact with the second one, that might interact with the third one. By the time you move over to the sentiment level, you've got a person expressing 2 or 3 ergs that are devoted to perhaps a single sentiment, or perhaps a whole lot of sentiments. But this one isn't. Yeah. I took the simplest one, but it can get much more complicated. Now, Cattell used the term surface traits. Oh, question? I'm sorry.
Which one is first established, the erg or the sentiment?
Well, the erg is the... So the erg is what awakens in you that you want to go in some direction. You want to seek something. So the erg would be first. And then you get the direction it's aimed at. And there are subcomponents. Move on to another area, Dan. We're going to move on to surface traits. And Cattell used this term, surface traits, to refer to behaviors that were not very generalizable. in describing personality. So they weren't important to him, but he talked about them anyway. Like, let's say, you like rock climbing, or you like swimming. Those are surface traits, but they really don't tell us a lot about you. We wouldn't want to make too many generalizations about your personality because you happen to like swimming or you happen to like rock climbing. And there are just multitude of these kinds of surface traits that you can name. But if you're trying to build a theory of personality, they're not really very helpful. Now, Cattell did spend a fair amount of time on intelligence. And he followed the conception of Charles Spearman that the G factor was the best explanation of intelligence. And G simply is just the letter G. Should put this up for you. Okay. Now, there are other ways of looking at intelligence. The G factor means that one thinks that you're either bright or you're not bright. And if you are bright, then you can pretty much do whatever it is you want to do. Now, Cattell thought about 80% of intelligence was genetic, and maybe about 20% of your intelligence was determined by some environmental influences. So you got about 80% is inherited, about 20% is environmental. Now, what's important, though, in all of this is that the theory that you take does make a difference in how you would look at people. Now, we're saying that in the G factor, if you're basically a bright person, you can learn to do most anything. Now, there are others who say that, no, intelligence is better explained by an S factor theory. The S factor theory would hold that you may do something very well at a very superior level, and it may not translate in that you do other things at a very superior level. So let's say if you are someone who does very well in mechanics, great with eye-hand coordination, very able to fix cars, that might generalize to the fact that you'd probably also be a good plumber. You might also be a good neurosurgeon. You might be a good dentist. I mean, if you have this specific factor that you work well with your hands, you can probably get a lot done. Whereas there are some, and the contrast between that and the G factor is the G factor person would say, well, no, if you're bright, you can learn to be a plumber, you can learn to be a surgeon, you can learn all of these things. I mean, if you're bright enough, all things can be available to you. This argument, by the way, is unsettled. And many people simply go with the G factor. Certainly we do in universities. But that is, we take people, we assume they're bright, they can learn whatever it is they wish to learn. On the other hand, if you look at tests that we give you, we do test to see what's your mathematical ability, what's your reading ability, what is your writing ability. So we seem to feel that there are a number of factors that we need to look at in order to understand how well you might do in the university. Now, there's a test, a very well-known test for intelligence called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is given to people individually. Like there's one tester, one person taking the test. And it produces a number of scores. It produces a verbal score. It produces a performance score. And it produces an overall score that is derived from all the performance scores plus all the verbal scores. Now, the fact that we divide it up that way, tells us that we do think there are various factors that contribute to intelligence. We also know from research in the brain that when people are injured, some people will lose an ability on, especially in the performance area. So that some people may maintain the same score, let's say, after surgery or after an accident. They may keep the same verbal score that they had before. They didn't lose those abilities. On the other hand, their eye-hand coordination may have deteriorated. Their ability to see certain relationships amongst objects may have deteriorated. So that we know that in terms of the brain, in terms of studying brain injury, there seem to be different parts of the brain that relate to different cognitive functions. And that's a problem. And because we haven't been able to really identify yet, as much as we would like, what those separate cognitive functions are and how they can be measured. When in doubt, by the way, if you ever wonder, like, well, is there anything that correlates rather well with general intelligence? It turns out to be vocabulary. Like, there are 10 subtests on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. Of those 10 subtests, the one that tends to correlate best with the overall IQ score is the vocabulary test. And you notice how often, when you've taken tests of ability, that there is a vocabulary section. Well, one reason is vocabulary. People who have very good vocabularies, understand a lot of words, tend to do well on the things that we call IQ. Now, the important thing in understanding intelligence with Cattell is that he believed that that if you had a lot of intelligence, he believed you would function very well. And he believed that it translated into all kinds of things. And he also got into a sense that people who are intelligent are better than people who are not. And as we go on with this discussion, you will see that this presents some real problems. We'll take a break now, and then we'll come back and finish Cattell, and we'll move on to Psyc.